Mid to end November 1941. The nights brought frost. Fortunately, in the Crimea, no brutal Russian winter was expected, and we did not experience the suffering throughout months of sub-zero temperatures to the extent of our comrades on the northern front. In the northern and central areas of the Crimean Peninsula, the winters are much like those we experience in Germany, with frost and snow. However, on the southern coast, the Russian Riviera, it remains relatively mild. The days and nights had already revealed to us that the winter clothing issued in accordance with the Army Service Regulations for a German infantry division was entirely too light, especially for the soldiers in the foremost exposed positions. In the front lines, we were compelled to live in open earthworks or behind stone walls, with only a roof of light canvas assembled from shelter quarters. In these primitive shelters, we were exposed to the mercy of the elements and made more miserable with the onset of frost and rain. Rear support units, such as supply and staff, usually took advantage of the opportunity to seek out warm quarters and would house themselves in available Russian dwellings, despite the ability of the large-caliber naval guns from Soviet ships and fortresses to reach these targets far behind us. Enemy fighters and Martin bombers attacked the battery positions, medical treatment centers, supply columns, staff quarters, and other select targets on a daily basis. To add to this stress came the onset of the muddy season. When a thaw came, the trails and roads became bottomless mires. The heavy truck traffic would literally be brought to a standstill. Once again, the supply lines for the forward troops would find themselves reliant on the tireless Ukrainian ponies pulling primitive carts. We in the forward elements had already become hardened by the deprivation and physical exhaustion constantly experienced throughout the previous months. Fighting, marching, and living under open skies, while often suffering from thirst and hunger, made the Lancers tough and enduring, without a gram of extra fat on the ribs. We learned the art of improvisation and self-sufficiency from the enemy. During the freezing nights, we insulated our bunkers and stonewall shelters with blue Navy overcoats stripped from the enemy dead in front of our positions. The Soviet Army dead provided us with thick brown flannel gloves as well. From somewhere far in the rear appeared instructions advising us that during the sub-freezing nights, the Wehrmacht socks could be used as gloves. Neatly written in precise military terminology was the recommendation that the frontline troops should cut 2 holes in a sock for thumb and trigger finger. Someone was obviously not aware that our boots had been almost worn to scrap, and that our socks were little more than rags, already with so many holes in them that we would have no difficulty in finding enough to poke all 5 fingers through. Like the mud in the freezing weather that had descended on us, the front line congealed and solidified. The enemy relentlessly attempted to win back Mackenzie and the southern heights, as well as Duvankoy. Our own forces remained too weak to capture the threatening sea fortress by surprise attacks, and the situation was further complicated by our lack of tanks and heavy artillery. The Soviet Fortress Army was able to win enough time to reinforce and strengthen its position and to mobilize defenses. With the Soviet fleet holding absolute control of the Black Sea, the fortress was able to receive supplies and reinforcements from the Kuban salient and the Caucasus without difficulty. Our own supply lines were extended for an untenable distance, stretching across the continent from the Crimea to the German homeland. Farther to the north, mechanical failures of the sensitive German locomotives became commonplace as they traversed the Ukraine in the bitter sub-zero temperatures. Whenever a temporary thaw was experienced, the motorized supply columns became mired in the mud of the soft, unpaved roads of the southern Ukraine and northern Crimea. The hard clay roads that had proved to be easily traversable during the dry summer months had become virtually impassable for the mechanized units as they attempted to plow forward through the softened, rain-soaked earth. The supply question alone had become a critical problem for the entire 11th Army. Because of the deteriorating supply situation, the heavy munitions were carefully conserved and could be used only sparingly. The rations became even more monotonous, consisting mainly of a tasteless barley broth mixed with a strange concoction of dried vegetables, derisively referred to by the infantrymen as Draftverhauer, augmented with the standard army-issue cheese squeezed from tubes. Shortly before being relieved by the 24th Saxon Infantry Division on the front lines of Mackenzie, we found ourselves again harassed by the propaganda machinery of the Red Party. We had long since become familiar with the leaflets encouraging us to desert, as tons of them had been dropped on us since our crossing of the Dnieper an eternity ago. The nights were now often filled with the screeching of loudspeakers emitting endless political speeches and crude attempts to convince us to desert to the enemy. German soldiers and workers, throw off the yoke of your oppressing imperialist and fascist clique. Come over to us, the farmer and workers' state. Clean, comfortable beds, beautiful women, good food and sweet wine awaits you, and your lives will be spared. This would be followed by the Communist International, to which we usually replied with angry bursts from our machine guns. With monotonous regularity, the routine would resume the following morning. A short time after being relieved on the line, we learned that an area of the sector previously held by our unit was lost to the Russians. We were aware that this setback could just as well have occurred while we occupied the positions. Nevertheless, our replacements were ridiculed by the Lancers as the Tango Division, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. So heated became the relationship between the 2 infantry divisions over these words that one of our Oberleutnants and an officer from Saxony were almost drawn into a duel, which had been illegal in the German army for a number of years. Only through the timely intervention of our commander was a serious incident prevented. In December 1941, the company administrative and supply offices were located near Bachtschisserei, a village on the main road leading to Simferopol. It consisted of a genuine cobblestone street, over which rolled the main supply column to the Sevastopol front. Before our village was an open area through which motorized vehicles passed only at full speed, and the pony carts clattered and bounced at a gallop. The now familiar phrase, "in view of enemy forces," was known to every driver, and they were fully aware of the danger along this particular stretch of road, even without the signs that were posted to warn personnel of danger. Passing vehicles would predictably draw enemy shells fired from a great distance on the northern sector of the Sevastopol fortress. The heavy 305mm projectiles, fired from an armoured embrasure on the battlement called Maxim Gorky I, blasted impressive craters along the road. Most of the Lancers heard the name of the great Russian poet for the first time when they questioned the source of these screaming, howling shells that routinely impacted near our position. I never knew if the Soviets themselves had named this massive cannon after the poet, or if it was simply one of the battlefield nicknames that had become widespread by the Lancers, whose lives had been made miserable by its presence. Bachtschisserei lay to the east of this road, artfully nestled in a picturesque valley. It was the old capital of the Crimean Tatars, and was the location of the castle of the Khan, complete with slender minarets and rich filigree work in arches. It was known for its 127 fountains, which, although dilapidated and worn, gave a distinct oriental impression of pre-Soviet grandeur. In the city bazaar we observed merchants who often bartered and traded items that would only be considered refuse by us. When word was received that we were to be relieved on the line, we had quickly dispatched our drivers to locate suitable quarters for us in the designated rest area. With their usual efficiency, they immediately had arranged lodging in a small Tatar dwelling. It had a small veranda, tastefully framed in carved woodwork, and water was drawn from an open cistern outside. The entire house consisted of 2 living rooms and was sparsely furnished. Along the walls were low benches for sitting and sleeping, and we were provided with a deep copper tub for bathing, a luxury long forgotten. 2 bent and wrinkled Tatar women engaged themselves in preparing hot water for us, and despite our protests, they insisted on stripping the mud-encrusted, threadbare uniforms from our thin frames, followed by earnest attempts to scrub the layers of filth from our bodies as we soaked in unaccustomed lavishness. We finally submitted with relaxed grins to the cleansing, after which we removed stubbles of beard with hot water, soap and razors. We quickly developed a friendly relationship with the occupants of the house, and we traded bread and saccharin with them in return for tobacco and fresh vegetables. They made it clear to us that the Tatar people were never friends of the Soviets, and that they deeply resented the Russianization of the Crimea, which had resulted in their becoming a minority of lesser status. There were a number of women and children in the house who constantly came and went with abandon, as well as an old man who seldom spoke. All men of military age had apparently been swept up and conscripted into the Soviet army during its retreat. An old woman of undeterminable age would sit like a mummy with a pipe in her toothless mouth, always occupying the same place on her bench. The only time that I ever saw her round face break into a smile was on the occasion when a child was born just before Christmas. Then the old woman came to life and constantly waddled back and forth, caring for the new mother and infant. Several days earlier we had seen a pregnant woman being carefully delivered to the house, and we experienced the birth of the little Ivan with his first cries in the room next to us. Afterward, one of our medics provided them with clean bandages, and we donated the few sweets we possessed to the young mother. Here the Lanzas and the Russian women celebrated the birth of new life, while a few kilometers distant, the destructive mechanism of modern war could be heard in its full power as the sound of impacting shells echoed across the gently rolling terrain. We were greeted throughout the day by the calls of the Muslim Imam, and we heard his voice singing from the tower of the mosque 5 times daily as he called the Islamic followers to prayer from sunrise to sunset. When resupplying us during the Mackenzie operations, 2 transportation personnel with our supply column had managed to cross over the steep, partisan-infested Yaila Mountains and reach the coastal road near Yalta. With the senses of hungry jackals, they immediately located a captured Russian depot. Adjacent to the barrels of sauerkraut and applesauce was a large store of wine. It was already sealed and closely guarded by Romanian troops and had been placed under the control of a strict German supply officer. Our 2 soldiers pleaded for permission to take something with them from the depot, but their pleas and sorrowful tales of hunger, cold and thirst in the forward lines were to no avail in softening the heart of the supply officer. The 2 decided to play on the sympathy of the Romanians, so with a field lighter and cigarettes they located a cooperative guard who, during the night, helped them to load several kegs onto their vehicle. The company supply Feldwebel surprised us with 3 large wooden casks of Crimean wine, which arrived perched on the back of a supply vehicle. Told that we should draw a limited ration from the kegs, we drank the deep red, priceless liquid from mess tins and field flasks as we sang The Mills of the Black Forest Valley. Added to our repertoire were a few ribald lyrics, typical of soldiers since time began, and eventually we emptied our battered containers. The driver devised a resupply system from a length of fuel line that ran directly from the casks through the open window to our quarters, where it could not be seen and controlled by our company spies. Unhindered, we continued to drink our fill of sweet Crimean wine throughout the night, in the finest tradition of Peter the Great and Empress Catherine of Russia. The following day, an award document for bestowal of the War Service Cross was prepared in the company administrative office, and a justification for the award was written and acknowledged for the obtaining of indispensable war material, wine. A vote was taken, and the company was unanimous in agreement that the award for our benefactors was in order. Our wounded company commander had returned. Strict but just, he always led the company with exemplary fairness, never asking of his men what he could not or would not do himself. His lacerated hands had been treated in the field hospital at Bakhchisaray, where it had been necessary to amputate some of the mutilated fingers. With bandaged hands he made his rounds through the company quarters, greeting the Lancers and inquiring about their needs. Despite his wounds, for which he could have been granted convalescent leave, he remained at the front in the company of the troops. Alois, his aide, assisted him in washing and shaving. Weapons and equipment were thoroughly inspected. The drivers constantly checked their vehicles to ensure that the motors fired immediately, even in the sub-freezing temperatures. We remained fully aware that our days of comfort and relative luxury in the rest area were numbered, and we could not escape the thoughts that soon our ordeal of waging war would resume. A pre-Christmas religious service was provided by the division chaplains of both confessions in the Khan's Castle Mosque in Bakhchisaray. The occasion would have remained in our memories as strikingly beautiful, if not for the recent horrors experienced on the Crimean battlefields that remained as yet unforgettable to us. According to the company schedule, and in strict observation of National Socialist political doctrine, attendance at religious events was voluntary, but almost the entire unit marched together to the mosque. Foresight, strength and faith remained the watchwords during these days of Advent. We longed for peace, and the initial excitement of war had been overcome by the strong desire to resume normal lives. We attempted to find comfort through the words of the priests and chaplains in grey, but our thoughts concentrated on home, the wounded, and the dead. In view of what we had recently witnessed together, and of what we had barely survived, the political philosophies and idealistic rhetoric that had brought us so enthusiastically into this foreign land had evolved into meaningless fragments. The first assault on Sevastopol loomed before us. Together with the 22nd Lower Saxony Infantry Division, we were assigned to attack the northern front of the enemy. This involved assaulting the complex system of fortifications, embattlements and cliff positions on the northern sector of the Sevastopol stronghold, and to push through to Severnaya Bay. Fully aware that the northern sector held the heaviest defences, we were advised that we must be prepared to take the bull by the horns. With this drive, the enemy was to be denied access to the harbour exit, cutting off any hope of further retreat for the remaining Soviet forces hoping to be evacuated by sea. The Army Command had drawn together all available resources for the attack. Only in the area of Kerch did a German division remain not committed to the assault. This division had been assigned the task of coastal security, replacing a weakly equipped Romanian division of questionable reliability. The pressing supply problems had rendered our complement of heavy artillery and munitions hardly sufficient to support a drawn-out, lasting battle. We were also desperately short of armoured personnel, and the few we did have available were faced with the immense challenge of traversing difficult terrain while fighting their way through a fortified network of resolute defenders. The Soviets lay deep within a series of fortresses of all types that controlled the battlefield. Our task became increasingly difficult as the weather worsened, bringing pouring rain that alternated with freezing nights to make life miserable for us in the trenches. During the night of 16 the 17th of December, our companies trickled into the forward preparation areas. The strongly defended northern sector of the coastal fortress behind the heights towering over the Belbek Valley covered an immense area from our position toward the east. The rain quietly drizzled throughout the night, but with the sunrise the day broke clear and calm. At 5 a.m. the assault began against the fortress along the entire Sevastopol front. The division moved forward in a massive wave close behind an immense artillery and smoke battery barrage. The first assault objective, the heights west of a terrain feature designated as Hill 319.9, was taken. Due to deep emplacement of enemy defensive positions, further ground could only be taken slowly and through elimination of stubborn pockets of resistance. The enemy defended themselves with skill and bravery, fighting for every foot of ground. Despite the excellent observation positions from the batteries, very few enemy positions were actually visible to the assaulting Lancers until they had approached within deadly range of the defenders. To the relief of the infantry, darkness fell early, forcing the foremost assault elements to halt for the night after reaching the first objective. On the 18th of December, the enemy continued to resist stubbornly from defensive positions situated on lines 217 to 253 and extending farther south. Manstein's 11th Army continued to press the assault, pushing the divisions forward at first light toward the northern sector of the fortress. At approximately 6:15 a.m., the enemy was forced from their defensive positions and pushed past the ravines and gorges south of Kamishli to the heights along lines 226, 228. By 3 p.m., almost all objectives had been reached, and further advance was again halted due to darkness. In the pre-dawn hours of the 19th of December, the 132nd Infantry Division moved forward in attempts to break through the enemy defences and capture the heights northeast of Chernaya and to secure the approaches to Severnaya Bay. Further attacks won ground very slowly against ever-stiffening enemy resistance. Constant counter-attacks from desperate naval infantry units were effectively repulsed, and our advance was slowed by previously unreported mortar batteries and long-range naval guns, which covered the line of our advance with a heavy blocking fire. The objectives assigned for that day were finally taken in the early morning of the 20th of December. In the right sector of the division, the town of Kamyshli fell to Infantry Regiment 436, and after heavy fighting, Hill 251 was captured by Infantry Regiment 438. The divisions to our left remained hindered by thick undergrowth and almost impassable terrain. Our division, together with the 22nd Infantry Division, was able to penetrate deep into the fortress defences. Our attack formations remained poised like an arrow pointing directly towards Severnaya Bay. The enemy, aware of our attempts to win the harbour approaches, threw new strength into the defences before us. Our point elements found themselves under a hail of bomber and fighter-bomber attacks, which took a heavy toll. It was Christmas Eve, 1941. Even during this holiest of times, a belief shared by soldiers fielded by both antagonists, the unforgiving god of war had taken no holiday. Upon the heights of Kamyshli, we settled into our holes and trenches dug into a former Russian field position. From the supply depot in the rear, the rations carriers brought each man a special issue ration, consisting of a canteen of Crimean wine and a loaf of white bread. They also brought mail, the first we had received in many days. In the light of a Hindenburg candle, huddled beneath the now faded and threadbare shelter quarter, I opened a package from home with fingers stiff and sore from cold. The package was not very large. The authorized weight was limited to 2 kilograms. A feeling of homesickness swept over me as I eagerly tore open the crumpled wrapping, and the sweet smell of gingerbread filled our surroundings, contrasting sharply with the acrid smell of unwashed woolen uniforms, heavy leather equipment, grease and oil. I had received a small candle mounted on a tiny star-shaped holder stamped from foil, a snip of evergreen twig from our Black Forest, a small bottle of Schwarzwälder Kirschwasser, and gingerbread, baked by my mother and packed with the greatest of care, using every bit of space possible for the long journey to the east. The frost glittered on the moist wall of the shelter, and our breathing left clouds of vapour hanging momentarily in the still air before being consumed by the darkness. Pressed tightly together, Wolf and I crouched within the damp cave hacked into the Crimean earth, and we held our hands close to the inviting warmth of the Christmas candle. We were no longer alarmed by the chatter of the Russian Maxim machine guns that stuttered in the distance, and we had come to ignore the shots cracking overhead. Our eyes stared into the candlelight from under the rims of cold steel helmets, battered and worn by the months of constant use. Wolf's downy cheeks revealed his youth. However, his eyes betrayed the years of a young man forced to grow old before his time. We had become old together and had developed a brotherhood between us, a closeness of spirit and trust that those who live in safety throughout their lives cannot know. He pulled a harmonica from his tunic pocket and softly played the traditional songs from home, O Tannenbaum, and Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. 2 Lancers from the neighbouring foxhole heard the harmonica and crept across the frozen ground to our position. With knees drawn beneath us, we were tightly pressed within the confines of our shelter, our bodies providing sparse but much-needed warmth for one another. The camaraderie that we experienced, the knowledge that each of us shared the longing to depart this place forever, softened the homesickness that we felt during these hours. The contents of the Christmas packages were equally divided. The wine from the canteens sent warmth through our cramped limbs. Once again Wolf played the songs on the harmonica, and with voices hoarse with cold we sang softly to the music. Outside, beyond the light of our candle, a flare sizzled skyward and cast ghastly shadows as it floated slowly over the frozen ground. Nearby, a Russian machine gun momentarily broke the stillness, and was immediately answered by the bark of a sniper's rifle slightly forward of our position. Silence quickly descended on the lines again, although there remained no peace on earth. After midnight, the gun crews, led by the platoon commanders, assembled in the tank trenches that had been captured earlier the previous day by our infantry battalion. With picks and entrenching tools, we set to work improving the trenches, no longer feeling the cold as we cut through the frost-hardened earth. The sky was suddenly illuminated when a Russian, some 200 meters distant, sent a flare sizzling toward the heavens. We threw ourselves flat on the ground and lay still until the flare, which floated lazily toward the earth for what seemed an eternity before striking the ground, sputtered furiously for a moment and extinguished itself. We sweated and strained against the gun as we wrestled it into position, and the morning horizon was growing light as the last heavy cases of ammunition were finally in place. We rested against the walls of the tank trench, our still figures draped with shelter quarters heavy with frost, and waited in silence before receiving word to post sentries. In the growing light of Christmas Day, we further explored the immediate area and found shelter in a former Soviet bunker near the tank trenches. The shelter was well built, constructed of thick tree trunks lying in various positions, and dug deep into the clay. The enemy, fully aware of the location of this structure, which they had abandoned only hours previously, soon targeted their former bunker. Once again we found ourselves under a barrage of artillery fire, and, just as during the countless barrages we previously had experienced, we resigned ourselves patiently to waiting out the hail of explosives falling about us. In a corner of the bunker, we located a small wood-burning stove. We engaged ourselves in roasting bread until the exploding projectiles from a 172mm gun crept closer to our position, shaking the earth and tossing fountains of dirt and debris skyward. With every explosion, soil was shaken from the rafters, and hunks of earth rained on our shoulders and helmets. Instinctively, we retreated to a far corner and pressed ourselves against the walls. Shell splinters and fragments of stone tore through the shelter quarter hanging in the entrance and bounced throughout the bunker. The barrage suddenly died, and as silence enveloped our position, we began to hope that the rain of shells was over. But suddenly we were overwhelmed by a tremendous explosion. Without warning, the blast from a massive shell exploded on the bunker and slammed us against the earth, leaving us dazed and almost unconscious. We staggered weakly to our feet, choking on cordite fumes and groping futilely through the thick smoke, unable to hear the cries of our wounded through the ringing in our ears. The blinding dust and smoke eventually cleared enough to reveal a large hole in the ceiling, through which filtered the cold grey light of the December day. 3 of the thick timbers had been shattered like matchsticks by the enormous projectile, and tons of earth, which moments before had rested on the timbers, now lay piled before us. We frantically began clawing at the mountain of dirt, using bare hands and helmets to shovel the heavy clay in attempts to free our missing comrades. With hands torn by stone fragments and wood splinters, we pulled 2 wounded men from the debris. Bohr was unconscious, with blood running over his face, and the other man had received injuries in both legs. He was unable to walk, and we suspected that he had suffered some broken bones. He appeared to be otherwise unhurt, and he remained talkative and alert, despite obvious pain. Several minutes after Bohr regained his senses, we completed the bandaging of his wounds. Of a total of 6 men in the bunker, miraculously only 2 had received more than superficial injuries. Most of us had escaped serious injury or death due to our position at the rear of the bunker, and we had been saved by a heavy supporting wall when the shell struck directly on the centre of the structure. When surveying the damage, we were all acutely aware of what fate would have dealt us if we had been directly beneath the impacting shell, where the shattered timbers and tons of earth had come to rest. Our chimney and bunker stove were completely destroyed, and the cold began pouring through the exposed ceiling. We placed Bohr on a self-propelled gun to be taken to the medical aid station. The shells continued impacting throughout the area, and a Russian flak battery located on a railway line began taking our position under direct fire. Understandably, under these conditions, the other wounded soldier refused to leave our position, choosing instead to wait until evening to be evacuated on the rations carrier. I reluctantly agreed to let him remain with us until evacuation could be accomplished in relative safety. Later that afternoon, the shelling increased to a steady, uninterrupted barrage, and our position fell under further direct fire from Russian small arms and howitzers. It became necessary to delay evacuation of the wounded soldier until the following morning. Several days later, we received word that he had died from gangrene complications that developed in the field hospital. In view of the nature of his wounds, I believe his death would have been avoided if he had received immediate medical attention from the field surgeon. Thereafter, I was determined to act on my better judgment and to seek treatment as soon as possible for the wounded, rather than to comply with their personal requests, which were usually made under the influence of great pain. During the night of the 26th of December, my gun crew crossed the tank trench and moved forward. At the bottom of the trench were lying a number of our comrades. They lay still and cold in death, wrapped in shelter quarters for burial, and we filed past them with eyes averted. The casualties had been heavy, and we attempted to dwell on other things, on what destiny would hold for us within the next minutes or hours. We lay before the rail embankment that led toward Mackenzie-Vigori. Despite harassing fire from enemy small arms, each pack was flanked by 2 men digging in and camouflaging the guns with a cover of grass and branches. We had received no warm food throughout the previous 2 days, and Wolf and I volunteered to serve as rations carriers. Shortly before dusk, we worked our way toward the rear, following our tracks back over the tank trench and onto a rise, from where the enemy could be observed from a close distance. Machine gun bursts cracked and sputtered behind us as we scrambled across the open ground, darting from cover to cover until we gained the safety of a small copse of trees. As we sprinted into the grove, a flak gun positioned on the railway fired into the treetops above us, and we ducked instinctively as splinters and branches crashed to earth around us. With pounding hearts, we finally reached our former bunker position and located the supply drivers, who issued us rations that had been reheated from the previous day. While we were drawing our rations, a number of Ilyushin fighters appeared on the horizon, and we watched them attack the foremost positions. They flew low and fast, dropping fragmentation bombs directly on our company, banking and returning to the attack with board cannons and machine guns. During a pause in the air attack, we made our way forward in the growing dusk with the steaming ration canisters strapped to our backs. As we approached our position, the platoon commander, Oberfeldwebel Weiss, stared at us in astonishment for several seconds before leaping to his feet. During our absence, my entire gun crew had become casualties. 2 Lancers had moved into our position immediately following our departure, and a Brisance bomb had scored a direct hit on the foxhole. They had died instantly when the bomb struck, and the platoon commander had unknowingly reported Wolf and me as killed in action. The men of the platoon wordlessly celebrated our return from the dead by hungrily devouring the hot food. We attempted to turn our thoughts from the loss of the 2 Lancers. We had experienced too many casualties to concern ourselves at this moment with what could not be avoided, so we simply accepted the losses and continued to concentrate on our own survival. In the past 6 months, we had crossed an enormous span of time and consciousness. The strength of the infantry companies had been reduced from 80 to an average of about 20 men. Despite these losses, the companies had been continually thrust into the fighting-ringing Sevastopol fortress, had succeeded in breaking through layers of the defences, and in fierce fighting had captured numerous strongpoints. Throughout the months of surviving in a brutal, unforgiving environment, each individual infantryman had exhibited remarkable endurance and adaptability while living in the open elements under the harshest of conditions, with only field rations for sustenance. My pack platoon now consisted of only 2 guns, which were normally served with a crew of 4 men to each gun. With 2 additional men, Wolf and I began training another gun crew. On the evening of the 27th of December, the infantry regiments prepared to launch a fresh attack. Part of the 50th Infantry Division was assigned to strengthen the left sector perimeter. At 7 a.m., the 28th of December, our forces pushed forward. The attack had been precipitated by a massive barrage from our artillery. The Nebelwerfer rocket launchers fired multiple projectiles that screamed over us, leaving long blue-white trails behind them before bursting on the enemy positions. Prisoners confirmed that the Nebelwerfers were much feared by the Soviet soldiers, who called them the bellowing cows. We referred to the rapid-firing Russian Katyusha rockets as Stalin's organs. We crouched in our forward positions and prepared to advance toward the enemy. The minutes passed slowly. The Lancers nervously smoked final cigarettes in silence, thoughts racing through their minds of the impending assault, of wives and children, of mothers and fathers, of the bodies seen the previous night, lying still and cold, wrapped in shelter quarters. Futilely, we attempted to concentrate only on the moment at hand. The machine gunners again inspected the actions and feed trays of their weapons, ensuring that their gleaming belts of ammunition were free of mud and sand so as not to jam the sensitive locking mechanisms of the weapons. Hand grenades were stuck into leather field belts and into the tops of our noble beckers. A Gefreiter silently crossed himself in prayer. Others pretended not to notice. As the final minute neared, the squad leaders sought to reassure the men, and with encouraging words they attempted to persuade us that with our battle-torn and weakened companies, we could again accomplish the impossible. The artillery barrage crept ahead, and wordlessly the ranks moved forward. After heavy fighting, Mackenzie-Vigori was taken. The numbers within the companies were fewer than ever. We positioned our pack close to the Mackenzie-Vigori train station, which offered us shelter next to a stone wall from the ever-present artillery rounds impacting at random throughout the area. The night was spent huddled beneath an immobilized Russian tank. During the night, snowfall covered the torn earth like a white linen cloth, as if attempting to cover the wounds of war. Only a few ugly black splotches revealed the fresh impact locations of the shellfire, and the light from a full winter moon illuminated the gleaming landscape with a silver frosting. Before dawn, Wolf and I requisitioned a white bedsheet from an abandoned house, with which we camouflaged the armoured gun shield of the park. In the grey morning light of the 29th of December, we took shelter in a low stone house. It was solidly built, with thick walls of natural stone, through which stared broken window panes. We later learned that it had previously been the home of the Mackenzie-Vigori railway station master. The air was cold, and we heated the stove built into the wall with splintered fragments of furniture. Somewhere Wolf found a small sack of potatoes, which we sliced for roasting on the iron stovetop. The aroma of the potatoes filled the primitive surroundings, and a wisp of smoke rose from our quarters into the still, milky morning sky. The enemy continued laying heavy but erratic fire on the area surrounding the train station throughout the morning, and dark circles of soil left by exploding shells could be seen in stark contrast against the clean white snow. A mortar round detonated against one corner of the building, but inflicted no casualties and caused only minimal damage to the structure. We stretched our aching bodies on the floor, relishing the luxury of the heated room, our appetites satisfied with the rare hot meal of potatoes fried with onions. We rolled cigars from gold-brown leaves of Crimean tobacco, which we softened in the steam of a battered brass samovar. We also cut tobacco for our pipes and found ourselves deeply engaged in discussion concerning the best method for preparing tobacco to obtain the maximum aroma. One claimed that it is best after being soaked in fig juice. Another firmly asserted that corn schnapps is best, either of which we did not have. In order to end the ridiculous argument, Conrad recommended that we use horse urine, which was one of the few things in our army that we seemed to have in abundance. The artillery fire increased as the sun climbed higher in the sky, reaching a crescendo as the god of war pounded on our positions, with impacting shells throwing geysers of earth skyward, seeking out the next victims. Our sentry took shelter alongside the low stone wall, and a nearby impact covered him with dirt and debris. His sun-bleached and ragged uniform was torn and dirty from the hail of earth, and he barely escaped death from the exploding shell. We found him lying prone on the ground, his arms shielding his face and his body and legs covered with bruises. We dragged him toward our shelter, ducking and throwing ourselves flat on the ground with each impacting artillery round. I assumed sentry duty from within the house, peering through the pane of a shattered window. Grey-black trails from exploding artillery shells hung in the air, and I observed a number of new mushroom-shaped clouds rising within our area before the barrage fell silent. 100 meters away, 2 houses were burning brightly in the crisp morning air. From my position, I observed 2 Lancers running through the streets between the huts of the village, dodging shell craters and holding their carbines at the ready. 2 red flares sizzled skyward, the signal for us to prepare to repel an enemy attack. The barrage of enemy fire had resumed, creeping forward and with most of the rounds appearing to land some 100 meters behind our position. As our alerted platoons stormed out of the building to man our gun position, I heard the sharp crack of a tank gun mixed with the racing whine of rifle and machine gun fire. We leaped to our anti-tank gun located 20 paces from where the rail line intersected the road. Kneeling alongside the weapon, I cranked the barrel toward the direction from where I heard the tank and leaned over the gun shield to obtain an unobstructed view of our field of fire. A battalion messenger ran past, frantically yelling, "Panzer! Panzer!" Peering over the steel shield protecting the gun crew, I caught sight of the top edge of a dark turret as it moved slowly between the houses. Pressing my right eye against the rubber ring of the optics, I attempted to follow the heavy vehicle as it moved toward us, partially hidden along a side street. With a racing heart, I rapidly rotated the barrel to rest where I had last viewed the enemy tank and adjusted the gun elevation for a range of 150 meters. With pulse pounding in my throat, I attempted to wait calmly for the tank to reappear on a rise in the street. As predicted, the steel colossus moved menacingly into the sights with its heavily armored bow facing us. With a trembling hand, I punched the firing button. The gun rocked back slightly, and it was possible to follow the path of the 37mm projectile through the gun sight. Horrified, I observed a trail of white smoke shoot skyward as the shell struck the turret. Ricochet. "Panzer! 40 meters!" I screamed without taking my eye from the optics. Our gun loader, Conrad, had already ripped open the case of special armor-piercing ammunition for use against heavy armor. With lightning speed, Wolf slammed the heavy, red-tipped projectile into the gun and snapped the breech closed. Before I could again press the firing button, I felt the cold air and the pressure wave on my cheek as a heavy round screamed past us, barely missing our position. It impacted directly behind us into a burned-out truck, exploding and throwing hunks of metal throughout the surrounding area. Once again, with the crosshairs of the sight firmly on the center mass of the tank, I pressed the firing button with the ball of my hand. With ears ringing from the detonation of our own weapon, we were unable to hear an impact of the round on the target. Wolf and Conrad had already reloaded our weapon when I observed a thin wisp of smoke climbing from the turret, followed seconds later by a blinding flash. A huge black mushroom cloud rolled upward into the frosty, clear blue sky. A mighty explosion ripped the turret from its mountings as the racks of ammunition inside the tank began detonating, and the turret was left canted on the chassis, its long gun pointing awkwardly toward the sky. A burst of machine gun fire tore into the fresh snow directly before us. Through the ringing in our ears, we heard a voice scream, "Tank on the right!" 4 men gripped the gun carriage tightly, and straining and slipping on the icy ground, we swung the gun to face another direction. I spied the second tank sluggishly turning among the village huts, and it slowly straightened its course before increasing speed. With plumes of smoke rising from exhausts, it accelerated toward us, smashing through a wooden garden fence at a range of about 80 meters. The heavy tank rocked to a halt, and the turret wound to face us. I rapidly attempted to find the target. Suddenly, through the crosshairs of the gun optics, I found myself staring directly into the round black muzzle of the enemy gun as I frantically adjusted our weapon for windage and range. Exactly as I had zeroed in on the first tank, the enemy gunner now lined us up in his sights. Miraculously, I was but a fraction of a second faster, a fraction of a second that would determine whether we survived this day or if we would be buried in an unmarked grave on a long-forgotten battlefield. Our first round slammed through the heavy turret, and we observed the crew scrambling from the smoking tank. "Tank at the front!" Again we swung the pack around, and behind the burning wreck of the first tank we could see the ghostly silhouette of a third. The massive machine broke through the smoke like rolling death. It came onward, lumbering toward us, accompanied by a number of Russian infantry, who, with levelled rifles, mounted bayonets, and loud screams of "Hurrah!" quickly gained the outermost line of houses in Makenzievy Gori. With a shot that penetrated the thick armoured belly, this tank slid to a stop, the turret slowly turning toward us. We sent another armour-piercing round into the tank, and it immediately burst into flames. Wolf and Conrad reloaded with deadly speed as we fired anti-personnel rounds into the ranks of infantry. A lone machine gun joined us in defending our position, and the attack was repulsed. I observed a fourth and fifth tank at a great distance, but the fleeting shadows of the turrets disappeared behind the crests of hills as we opened fire on them. The supporting infantry retreated, only to fall into the blocking fire of our mortar crews and artillery batteries. At the pack, we threw our arms into the air and screamed unintelligibly at one another in uncontrollable elation. The entire action had spanned no more than a few seconds of indescribable terror, and we were consumed with relief for having escaped an almost certain death. After several long minutes of celebration, I began to reconstruct in my thoughts the excellent coordination exhibited among the men of my gun crew. Every movement, every action, and every word had been deliberate and had produced results. The endless drills and exercises with the gun, the curses, the complaints, the sweat, flesh and blood spent during the past months had on this day saved our lives. Our artillery batteries now opened fire, sending countless shells that rained on the ranks of the fleeing enemy. Pohl and his crew dragged his pack across the railway embankment to reinforce our sector. A single self-propelled gun rattled past our position toward the Soviet line, the crew hidden from sight beneath the heavy armour, and for the moment our defensive battle was over. During the previous months, the repulse of an attack would have been followed up with an immediate pursuit of the enemy by fresh, full-strength German units in counterattack. Fresh units could have penetrated deep into the Sevastopol line to capture the armoured embrasure 626, later referred to in reports as Stalin. This action could have then achieved a breakthrough to the bay, thus splitting the Soviet forces. Under the existing conditions, we had only battle-weakened companies available that did not possess sufficient reserves to carry through an additional push. The companies of our infantry regiments had become too weakened through the months of constant casualties to fulfill assignments. The 9th Company of our regiment now consisted of 18 men. The acting company commander was a Feldwebel. For weeks, the men had lain without relief before the enemy, beating back Russian attacks and then assaulting forward again. Added to the stress and deprivations of battle was a climate that took its toll on morale and fighting effectiveness, wet, cold days and freezing nights. In the trenches, the Esbit stoves or a candle held beneath the cover of a ragged shelter quarter provided the only warmth for aching joints and sore hands. We were painfully aware that our light clothing issue would not suffice during a Russian winter. In response to the calls on the public for assistance by our all-knowing leaders in brown, sitting far from the fighting in the east, clothing was being collected for the soldiers of the Eastern Front. The warm ski sweaters, fur vests, sport clothing, heavy blankets, wool socks and mittens thus provided by the Winter Relief Agency first reached us in February 1942. By twilight, Wolf and I crept into no man's land to the second Russian tank that we had put out of action, the only one that had not burned of the 3 that had fallen to our gun. From an open hatch on the turret hung the body of the young tank commander. Together we pulled the corpse from the opening in the heavy steel armour, and I unbuckled his belt and took his gloves, pistol and map case. We dismantled the gun optics, and in the process I noted that the crosshairs were sighted directly on the position of our park. We opened the breech of the gun and slid the heavy projectile from the chamber, letting it fall to the floor. We were painfully aware that this was the very projectile that would have killed our entire gun crew had we not been a fraction of a second faster. The tank had been knocked out by our single round, which had penetrated the turret just below the ammunition rack, instantly killing the Soviet gunner. As the last traces of the sun disappeared on the horizon, the noises of the restless front increased, and under cover of darkness we crept back toward our quarters in the old stone house. As we were returning, we discovered a culvert under the railway embankment running toward the southwest, large enough for a 10-year-old child to walk through standing upright. Inside the culvert, pressed closely together, we found a number of civilians, almost entirely women and children. The women and girls were wearing thick woolen scarves wrapped around their heads and necks, and their bodies appeared to be large and stocky in their thickly quilted clothing. Through frightened, quivering lips they pleaded, "Vota nada," we need water, and I replied, "Vota budid," you will have water. A middle-aged woman who appeared to be the boldest among them followed me with a pail, and I led her to the well behind our stone house. She thanked me with an unintelligible outpouring of words and much spessiva before trotting nervously back to the culvert. It was apparent that the tiny cluster of women and children had been crouching for several days in the confined area, where it was possible neither to stand upright nor lie prone. Packed closely together with drawn knees, they remained sitting like lost pearls in the dark confines of the culvert. Unfortunately, it was the safest location for them to be during the heavy artillery barrages that constantly swept the area, and we could not offer them anything better in way of shelter. The following day, a Russian aircraft bomb buried the tunnel entrance. The next morning, a lone Russian soldier, his rifle with fixed bayonet in hand and fur cap pulled low over his forehead, ran frantically past our quarters, his long overcoat flowing behind him. Through his hoarse cries of "Ura!" we could not determine if he was drunk or had lost his senses. At a distance of 20 paces, I called to him, "Stoi! Ruki Werk!" A short distance away, he drew to an abrupt halt and looked about, finally fixing his eyes upon us. Instead of tossing his rifle aside and raising his arms, he squeezed the trigger of his rifle, firing at us from the hip as he charged forward with levelled bayonet. The bullet struck the stone wall of the house behind us, and with no other alternative I raised my carbine and shot him at point-blank range. At midday, our company commander, accompanied by 2 other staff officers, entered the stone house without prior notice. In acknowledgement of our accomplishment in repelling the tank incursion on the previous day, he awarded each member of the gun crew the Iron Cross, pinning the award on our tunics with bandage-wrapped hands. Over the Christmas holidays, our division was reinforced with a replacement battalion. I recognized one of the replacement personnel as Hans, from my hometown in Württemberg. We had known one another since youth, and we were more than pleased to see that both of us had thus far survived the war. Hans had been shot through the neck during the early stages of the Russian campaign, and after recovering from his wound, he had received orders to report to us as a replacement. The men of the replacement unit had been en route to the front for weeks. The first phase of transport across the steppe was in cattle cars with no heat, after which the great distance from Perekop to the Crimea was covered by foot. According to Hans, all the men were glad to be back with the masses again, as it was only in the company of Lancers that we now felt truly at ease. One morning, after a probe by a Soviet company against our defences, we came on a Russian with an abdominal wound lying upon the railway embankment. Holding his hands over his wound as if in prayer, he was whimpering softly for water, and through his unintelligible pleas we heard him muttering "Christ" with a trembling voice. His pale face was drawn and turned toward the leaden sky, and his eyes flickered from one of us to another, seeking pity and relief from the hated enemy from whom he had been taught to expect no quarter. Hans departed for a moment before quickly returning with 2 Russian prisoners, who carried the badly wounded soldier back to the medical aid station on a makeshift stretcher that they had fashioned from army overcoats. It was rumoured within the company that a few days previously the division chaplain Zatzger had inadvertently passed through the foremost positions during a visit to the front lines, before suddenly finding himself surrounded by Soviet soldiers. Fortunately, a Russian soldier who could speak some broken German was among them, and Zatzger talked the 10 enemy infantrymen into surrendering and brought them back with him to company headquarters. On this isolated battlefield, we received little news regarding political or military developments in the world. News from home was scarce, and the theatre of war around us overshadowed all else lying beyond our immediate realm. The overextended supply system was strained to its limits in providing us with desperately needed war material, and personal correspondence had to be considered of secondary importance. When we learned that America had entered the war against Germany, we listened intently and somberly. Many of the Lancers, regardless of rank or education, now believed that only the greatest of skill and luck could bring us total victory. However, despite the knowledge that the bulk of the world's industrialized strength was turned against us, never did we at that time realize the full extent of the defeat that was to befall us. I recalled my father speaking of how all was lost for Germany with the entry of the United States into World War I. These comparisons were made, and within circles of close friends we discussed our dubious situation. Even the infantrymen, living in holes hacked from the frozen ground and fighting an enemy that seemed to grow stronger daily, came to realize that Germany could not hope to win a war against the entire world. Nevertheless, our only hope and chance for survival was to place our trust in the leadership of the Crimean army and in the proven abilities of Generaloberst von Manstein. Eventually, he too would follow the path of many of our most talented officers in refusing to bow to the impossible demands and the absurd political doctrines of the dictator in Berlin. Manstein's armies would be taken from him as the war wore on, leaving us in the field often to be led at the highest levels by party followers with little military talent. Some of these officers would attain a general's rank through what could only be recognized as misguided political appointments, rather than through merit on the battlefield. In the late afternoon of the 31st of December, we learned through a courier that the front was to be pulled back, and the area now occupied by our forces was to be evacuated. During the night, we pulled our gun over the embankment and onto the road that led northeast toward Kamyshli. After several hours, we arrived at the newly established forward lines, and by morning we were at the company assembly area near Bachtschissere. Initially, we failed to understand why it was necessary to give up such a large area, for which we had so heavily paid with the blood of our comrades. The two assault divisions had, over the days of Christmas, penetrated deeply through the Russian-held territory. From our forwardmost positions, we had been able to hear the foghorns at night of the Russian ships on Severnaya Bay, the lifeline for the enemy. These deep penetrations had left our flanks dangerously exposed to an enemy who was continuing to be reinforced from the sea. Thus, the line had been adjusted to eliminate the possibility that we might be severed from our main battle group. Before Feodosia, January 1942. The division war diary entry explained that due to extraordinary events on the Crimea, it was deemed necessary to revise the planned assault against Sevastopol. Only later did we learn of the danger in which the Crimean army had found itself. On the 25th of December, the Russians had carried out successful landings near Kerch, where only a single German infantry division had been positioned during the fighting at Sevastopol. Organized partisan units had received orders from the higher Soviet command to sever the supply route to the Crimea along the corridor near Perekop, and on the 29th of December and through early January, the Russians landed at Eupatoria and in the harbour of Feodosia. Through tenaciously defending their position, the division occupying Kerch was successful in halting the Russian penetration. Eupatoria was retaken by encircled reconnaissance units, and the partisan units were driven back. The 46th Infantry Division at Kerch fought a withdrawing action to the west to avoid being encircled, as only part of one Romanian cavalry division, a supply unit, and a weakened pioneer battalion were available as reinforcements. The situation for the army in the Crimea had become critical. During the first days of January 1942, the division marched through Simferopol, the main city of Crimea in the sector to the north of Karasubasar. Due to a thaw that turned all roads into a bottomless morass, headway was made only through the extraordinary efforts of the men and horses. In many instances, teams of horses could be observed harnessed to motorized vehicles. The reliable animals were often able to make slow but deliberate headway through the mud, but the mechanized transports remained helplessly mired in place. With the further movement of units marching toward the east, the artillery and most of the supply units could move only on the hard surface of the Karasubasar-Stary road in order to make any progress whatsoever. The assault on Sevastopol had cost the division such heavy losses that the division commander, Generalleutnant Sensenich, deemed it necessary to dissolve one battalion in each regiment to bring the remaining battalions up to fighting strength. Sensenich left the division on the 5th of January 1942 to be replaced by Oberst Lindemann, a brave and talented officer. An offensive was scheduled for the 15th of January, and the 132nd Infantry Division was assigned to push through and over Hill 132.3 to the Black Sea and onto the Bay of Feodosia. To the left was positioned the reinforced Infantry Regiment 213, and the sector to our right was assigned to the 170th Infantry Division. Shortly before twilight, we received reports of prepared Russian defences southwest of Hill 132.13. Under cover of two machine gun posts, we pulled our pack across the frozen grey no-man's land, with the gun shield facing forward. We took up a position on a gentle slope, from where we could see the Bay of Feodosia. The Black Sea was visible to us for the first time, seen as a dark grey line on the horizon. We opened fire with our pack upon a group of Russian vehicles and armour that was unwisely situated on the open steppe at 1,500 metres distance. The Russians returned the fire from tanks and heavy mortars, and the impacting rounds burst on the crest of the slope behind us. During the exchange of fire, a gunner manning another pack in our company was killed by an exploding shell. I carefully readjusted the rangefinder and sighted our pack on a distant target. Once again we found ourselves facing the deciding minutes of life and death on the battlefield. If the enemy armour had our position fixed and were quicker and more skilled than we, then we would have found our graves on this hillside. With a burning eye against the rubber eyepiece of the optics, I pressed the firing button and followed the path of our shell, holding my breath as the projectile was lost from sight against the tiny black target in the distance. The crew piled out of the armoured vehicle, indicating that our shot had struck home and had disabled the tank. A 105mm battery of our division artillery immediately opened fire, and within minutes the entire Russian-occupied field was enveloped in a thick cloud of dust and smoke. We continued to fire rapidly into the haze with anti-personnel rounds. The Soviet positions, which otherwise would have served as a bridgehead for a counterattack on our newly established lines, disappeared under a hail of artillery fire. The protecting darkness swept over us, enveloping friend and foe and bringing an end to the exchange of artillery fire. During the night, a reconnaissance platoon brought in several prisoners, providing information for pressing an attack the following day. An icy wind whistled out of the northeast. We lay pressed tightly together in the trench dug alongside our gun, praying that we would not be tormented with rain or snow as we shivered in the darkness on the hillside. Covered by shelter quarters and wrapped in bits of spare clothing, we passed the night on the frozen steppe before Feodosia. Dawn provided scant relief as the sun sporadically pierced grey clouds, offering little warmth. At midday, we provided security for the infantry units with our pack as they advanced on Feodosia. Before us lay an open field of fire, and across the dry earth of the steppe, the infantry moved relentlessly toward the sea, appearing as tiny moving specks in the distance that eventually disappeared over the horizon. During the initial hours of the attack, the harbour had been bombed by Stukas, and we were able to detect burning houses, storage facilities, oil tanks, and expanses of factories in the approaches to Sarigol. Above the harbour of Feodosia, a massive black cloud of smoke hung in a clear winter sky. From the positions to our rear, the sound of rifle fire suddenly broke forth. One of the pack support vehicles, which was parked some 100 metres behind us in a depression, burst into sight with a wildly racing motor, pursued by erratic rifle and submachine gun fire. We swung the gun about to face our rear, with no visible sign of the enemy. Reaching our position, the driver, Fair, fell breathlessly from the cab of the truck, exclaiming, "The Russians are behind us and have overrun the assembly positions." He further reported that he was able to hear the alarm being sounded from regimental headquarters. He knew nothing of the fate of the other driver, other than that he also had been observed leaping into his vehicle within sight of the oncoming Russians, suggesting that perhaps the truck had been struck by a round that rendered it immobile. We later recovered the vehicle to find the driver slumped over the steering wheel, killed by a single shot to the head. The attackers poured out of the depression. There were at least 100 Russians streaming with a loud "Hurrah!" toward our 7-man pack crew and one machine gun position. Rifle shots slammed into the side of the vehicle and ricocheted off the glacis plate of our gun. Hans took charge of the machine gun position. Laying his machine gun across the ammunition trailer, he fired a long burst from a standing position. The first anti-personnel round from our cannon struck a tall Russian at the forefront, and his severed torso bounced across the ground. Through the roar of the weapons, the cries of "Hurrah!" grew lighter. The khaki-brown-clad bodies piled thick before us, partially hidden in the dry winter grass. Despite our desperate defence, they continued to creep slowly forward under the protection of rippling submachine gun and rifle fire like a swarm of insects, resolutely crawling ever closer, refusing to turn back. Through the magnifying optics of the pack, the Soviets appeared large and terrifying, the muzzle bursts from their submachine guns filling the sight picture. I began to sight on the enemy soldiers independently. Those closest to us were lying motionless, but new shapes continued to appear from the depression. Suddenly our machine gun jammed. Through a hail of rifle fire, our munition carriers wrenched more cases of ammunition from the caisson, and the loaders, soaked with sweat despite the cold, continued to ram one shell after another into the hot breech of our gun. An Unteroffizier lying next to me near the wheel of the carriage was firing short, sustained bursts from his submachine gun when he suddenly rolled backward, screaming with pain. We had no time to assist the wounded, only to fire, and fire to save our lives. Having cleared the jammed feed tray, Hans opened fire again with the Spandau. The mound of spent shell casings behind the cannon continued to grow. Someone yelled, "Last case of anti-personnel." The high-explosive ammunition was quickly depleted, and we continued firing at solitary figures with armor-piercing rounds. The ammunition bearers knelt with their carbines over the right side of the gun carriage and opened fire toward our flank as some Russians attempted to circle around us. Tossing hand grenades that exploded 20 meters before us, the Russians desperately pressed home the attack in an effort to prevent the protecting harbor of Feodosia from falling into our hands. Despite their individual courage, they vainly died in the attempt. The roar of the weapons slowly subsided as the enemy survivors crawled back into the protecting depression. They were later taken prisoner by infantry units that were sent out for mopping-up operations, and the prisoners filed past our gun on their march toward the rear, bearing their wounded with them. The wounded Unteroffizier was still lying behind the protection of the pack. We cut off his boot and bandaged the leg, which had been hit by a rifle bullet just below the knee. An exit wound was visible, which displayed a clump of bloody flesh protruding from the sole of his foot. We carried him to our only remaining intact vehicle, and Fair drove him to the rear. We later learned that after cursory treatment, he was evacuated further to a central medical facility, where the field surgeons deemed it necessary to amputate his lower leg. For the next 12 hours, we continued combing our surrounding area and brought in additional prisoners, many of whom were wounded, and they were escorted to regimental headquarters. Our rifle companies pushed onward, reaching the Black Sea coast. On the point was the 1st Battalion Infantry Regiment 436. Protecting their flank was Infantry Regiment 437. The town of Sarigol, a northern suburb of Feodosia, was firmly in our hands by late evening, and all approaches from north and south were secured. This action sealed the fate of the still unoccupied city of Feodosia. General von Manstein acknowledged in his official report that our 132nd Infantry Division had led the decisive push to the sea. On the 18th of January, the remaining Russian forces still holding Asambe broke through the German lines and harassed the combat units by destroying communications cables and creating a nuisance behind our lines. They suffered heavy casualties through concentrated artillery fire, and after several days were scattered and effectively destroyed as a fighting unit. Throughout the fighting around Sarigol, enemy amphibious troops had suffered heavy losses, the dead lying thick in the streets and on the shore of the sea. During the night of 18th of January, 3 Russian tanks attempted to break out of the German encirclement, but were knocked out by anti-tank mines planted by our pioneers along the southern edge of Sarigol. The division wheeled toward the northeast, and on 19 and the 20th of January, we approached the defence lines to the east and northeast of Dalkamishi, which was ordered to be held until the onset of the Kerch offensive. On the 19th of January, Infantry Regiment 438 advanced west of the coastal road of Dalkamishi and the surrounding heights. The movement was carried out according to plan against weak enemy resistance. In the morning hours, the division headquarters was moved to Blish by Buga. All movements experienced harassment from enemy aircraft, despite snow flurries and clouded skies. Feodosia and the outlying areas had suffered heavy damage from Stuka attacks and artillery fire. A number of damaged transport ships lay in the harbour, and large quantities of war material had been abandoned in the areas evacuated by enemy forces. On the 20th of January, the enemy aircraft activity increased, During the evening, Corps directives were received to prepare defensive positions along the Daln-Kamishi line. On the 21st of January, the division headquarters was moved toward Feodosia. The temperatures plummeted to minus 30 degrees centigrade. The Wehrmacht report of the 19th of January, addressing the Battle of Feodosia, stated, German and Romanian forces under the command of General der Infanterie von Manstein, in coordinated actions with Luftwaffe units under General der Flieger Ritter von Greim, have thrown back Soviet forces and have occupied the city of Feodosia. A total of 4,600 prisoners have been captured, as well as 73 armoured vehicles, 77 field guns, and large quantities of war material. The successful termination of the battle for Feodosia eliminated any immediate danger for the army in the Crimea. In defensive positions on the narrow peninsula of Kerch stood the 30th Army Corps with the 132nd Infantry Division at the forefront. To our left, the 42nd Army Corps with the 42nd Infantry Division and the 18th Romanian Infantry Division in reserve. The attempts of the Russians to break out of the Feodosia sector toward Shankoy-Perekop and to swing around the bulk of the 11th Army proved to be unsuccessful. As a result of constant breakout attempts by isolated Soviet forces, an order was received to concentrate on the mopping up of all enemy resistance remaining in rear areas.